No wonder so many people in Westeros are poisoned with Arbor Reds. Welcome to the Great Hall of Winterfell and Westeros, finally. Whoops, that's not supposed to be there. Come on, Daenerys. Or was it Sansa? Anyways, it's been a long journey to get here, so apologies for my lateness. I originally set out with this project to make a guide for all officially licensed beverages produced for Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon, but due to the lengthy runtime of Game of Thrones, the drinks released in tandem with it were many. As such, they alone will likely need to be broken up into no less than 3 videos. So, today, we'll be focusing on the HBO-sanctioned beverages released for House of the Dragon, and determining which of the wines would pair best with which of the recipes from the 2 Game of Thrones cookbooks that have been released. Although a raven did tell me that there is a 3rd on the way this October. Speaking of, I've thoroughly enjoyed Season 2 thus far. This is not a review of the show itself, so no worries about spoilers here. We'll specifically be focusing on the wines and ciders on the website houseofthedragonwines.com. There were also some beers brewed by and released in partnership with Mikkeller of Denmark, but there's absolutely no shot I can get those or the cider, so I'll just provide a brief overview of them right now before we start pouring the wines. They released 4 beers in Europe for the debut of the first season of House of the Dragon. Named after Rhaenyra and Daemon Targaryen's respective mounts, the first 2 releases were Syrax and Caraxes, followed by Syrax Rises and Caraxes Rises. Syrax, the beer, was a 3.5% session IPA brewed with Styrian dragon hops, lending earthy, spicy notes and a grapefruit citrus-like quality. Caraxes, the beer, was a non-alcoholic product at just 0.3% alcohol. They took their alcohol-free beer base, called Limbo, and added dragon fruit, lending subtle fragrant notes of kiwi and pear, and presumably dragon fruit. The next release was called Syrax Rises, upping the ante at 5.5%. It was an American-style IPA with notes of candied fruit and citrus and a bitter finish, apparently reminiscent of orange pith and juicy grapefruit, straddling the divide between West Coast and East Coast American IPAs. Lastly, they released Caraxes Rises. Soaring to 6.5%, it was a chili stout imparting spice and sweetness with notes of cacao nibs, coffee, cinnamon, and a peppery bite. I would have really liked to try these, but it was a largely European exclusive release and I wasn't able to locate it here in Colorado. I think the choice to use Styrian dragon hops was fitting and unique for Syrax, and Syrax Rises clearly tried to unify the divided American styles, just like Rhaenyra once tried to unify Westeros under her leadership. The use of dragon fruit for Caraxes was also fitting for both a naming convention and color choice, and the stark contrast of shooting from a refreshingly fruity 0.3% alcohol to a heavier 6.5% for the syrupy and spicy Caraxes Rises reflects Caraxes' hot-tempered and erratic behavior, not unlike his rider. Moving on to the more available beverages, there are currently 4 wines and 1 cider made for the prequel series. A Red Blend, a Cabernet Sauvignon, a Pinot Noir, a Chardonnay, and a Dragonfruit-Pomegranate Imperial Cider. While not readily apparent on the website, after some light digging, the producer of the wines and ciders is none other than Vintage Wine Estates. The wines were vinted and bottled by their division Seven Kingdoms Cellars, while the cider was produced by Ace Ciders, another brand they own. Before we get into tasting them, I would like to talk about branding and lament what I perceive as some missed opportunities with these releases. Allow me to read from their website. The finest varietals, a collection of treasures. Bend the knee and display your loyalty to the House of the Dragon with a collection of limited, handcrafted wines and cider. House of the Dragon Wine Collection roars with varietals to pique your everyday interests. The collection includes the king of all wine varietals, Cabernet Sauvignon, a fiery blend of winemaking that crafts the sensational red blend, and a Pinot Noir so seductive that it makes you come back for more each time. This kind of flowery marketing prose very much reminds me of the gin and tonic skooma absinthe we talked about a few months ago. It uses a lot of buzzwords, but ultimately falls flat because it doesn't understand its target audience. It doesn't say anything that convinces wine nerds to buy it, and it has virtually no true connections to the world of Westeros beyond the label images matching the Targaryen house sigil and the HBO show name. The world that George R.R. Martin has created contains a litany of distinct wines, from Arbor Red and Gold bottlings to Dornish Reds and the intense Mirish Fire wine. There have been a number of articles speculating on the most accurate real-life equivalents to these, taking into account the regions that inspired the respective locations in Martin's world and the wines produced in them, as well as the tasting notes mentioned in his writings. Since it's a fantasy setting, I think you could get away with not using wines from those regions, as it's all made up, but to not bottle these wines under the names of wines readers are familiar with truly feels like a missed opportunity to me. I would rather pick up a bottle of Arbor Red for a watch party than just House of the Dragon California Cabernet Sauvignon. Perhaps it's a pedantic distinction, but still. They could have named the bottles after book counterparts, but included a subtitle containing the actual grape and region distinctions to remain in the good graces of the TTB. Alas, I was unfortunately not in charge of their brand strategy. However, once we've tasted these wines, I believe we should be equipped to determine their closest book equivalents. Not only this, but there are enough drink recipes in the 2 Game of Thrones cookbooks that have come out so far to make use of these House of the Dragon wines in some recipes that would be right at home in the pages of Martin's prose. As such, I'll just be tasting the smallest glasses of them to reserve the rest for those recipes, and this will likely need to be a 2-part video. Subscribe so you don't miss the drink recipes we use the rest of the bottles for. Since I was unfortunately unable to locate the Imperial cider in the state of Colorado, we'll have to just read the description from the website and take them at their word. I'm a little saddened by this because the use of dragon fruit and pomegranate does sound delectable. Dragonfruit-Pomegranate brings a refreshing blend of tart pomegranates and sweet dragon fruits blended with our signature Imperial-style cider. While different, these 3 families of fruits come together into an unstoppable and delicious refreshment. Dragon fruit, for obvious reasons reflected previously in Mikkeller's Caraxes beer, draws up some draconic imagery, and pomegranate invokes a blood-red hue and bears historical ties to ancient Greece in our world, which inspired many of the cultures outside of Westeros, perhaps with the exception of 𝖆𝖑𝖦 at least. To preserve our palates on the wines themselves, let's taste them in order of tannic intensity. This means that we'll start with the only white wine in the lineup, the House of the Dragon Chardonnay. Unfortunately, this product page on the website lacked a description or any notes from the winemaker, which will be present on all 3 of the reds we'll taste after. Grown in California, our Chardonnay displays power and grace with aromas of ripe lemon, fresh citrus, and subtle oak. The longer time on the vine allows her flavors of vanilla and green apple to shine through, creating a round and silky wine worthy of the throne. If that doesn't scream Arbor Gold, I don't know what does. To quote A Storm of Swords, Cersei beckoned to her page for another cup of wine, a golden vintage from the arbor, fruity and rich. Also, given the green apple note, it would have been clever to allude to the Greens faction in the Targaryen Civil War. The label even has a slight green tint to it, come on. Let's give this a taste and see how it compares to their notes. Got a lot of citrus and just a hint of oakiness on the nose. And the palate has a malic acidity, and yes, a little bit of crisp apple, so I think that the green apple note is fair. It is a very dry wine, which I'm a fan of, and it's got just a soft vanilla and hint of toasty oak on the finish.
That just tastes like a white wine. It's not very dry, but it's not very sweet. It's just a white wine.
Before we progress to the reds, we'll need to consider the recipes of the cookbook to decide what to use this House of the Dragon Chardonnay in. Luckily, the number of recipes that use white wine kind of makes the decision for us, as there are only 2. Honey-sweetened wine and Mirish Fire wine. The honey-sweetened wine specifically calls for a semi-sweet white wine or rosé though, and this one is decidedly drier. The other recipe does not clarify the sweetness of the wine requested, so I think by default, this will inevitably become our Mirish Fire wine. Moving to the lightest of the reds in our flight, the House of the Dragon Pinot Noir. Pinot Noir is a noble grape that has gained the reputation as the heartbreak grape, as it has broken the hearts of thousands of winemakers alike. This meticulous grape requires fine handling to get it just right. Once achieved, it is refined and romantic in nature that is true magic in the glass. This description practically feels like it was written by someone in Dorne, with all the talk of romance and heartbreak reminding me of my sweet viper, Oberyn Martell. The mastery of winemaking described also serves as a clear parallel to Dornish reds, as the winemakers of Dorne are very proud of their vintages and often look down on the vintages of the Arbor as lesser. To quote a wine seller who was attempting to sell a poisoned bottle to Daenerys, it sings of plums and cherries and rich dark oak. Vinted in Oregon, this Pinot Noir is enticing on the nose with lovely aromatics including tart red cherry and cranberry, followed by subtle earthy and savory notes. The palate is medium-bodied with silky textures and delicious bright red fruit that shows just a bit darker in the profile than the nose. This gem is garnet in color and lingers with a long fruit-filled finish. The bottle deviates from these descriptions slightly, mentioning seductive aromas and flavors of bright black and red cherries. Like the Chardonnay mention of green apple before it, this would have been an ideal candidate to brand this wine as a choice drink of the Blacks faction of the Targaryen Civil War. It even has a more black coloring on the label. The obvious marketing choice is right there. Lastly, from the website, we also get our first treat of notes from the winemaker on their production process. Gentle techniques in the cellar and imagination in the vineyard achieved a fruit-driven style. The grapes were fermented in a combination of small open-top fermenters and stainless steel fermenting tanks with selected yeasts propagated from cellars in Burgundy, pressed during the last days of fermentation and racked as soon as the wine finished malolactic fermentation. Aging took place in a combination of small French oak barrels and larger stainless steel tanks for 8 months. While I still believe Old World wines would have better reflected the terroir and profiles of the wines found in Westeros, Essos, and beyond, I'll take the inclusion of French oak barrels and the yeast propagated from Burgundy as a nod to that region at least. There is a chocolatiness on the nose here, with some bright berry and an earthy character, almost like a chocolate-dipped strawberry. On the palate, there's a surprisingly rich cherry, some raspberry, and hints of herbaceousness. It is very much tart, so the mouthfeel is a little dry, but it's a little softer. It's not quite so crisp as the Chardonnay. It is more dense than most Pinot Noirs I've had, but also when I think Pinot Noir, I don't immediately think rich and dense, so maybe that's just playing into it with the French oak coming into play here, but I like it a lot. That's a tasty, tart, refreshing sip. And of course that finish, again, very tart, but lots of berries, you can really taste them, and just another kiss of French oak at the end. The tartness of this Pinot Noir further solidifies my classification of it as a Dornish red. According to Cersei Lannister, Dornish reds are as sour as the Dornish.
This one smells syrupy. I'm just not super into red wine, I don't think. Like, it's fine. I don't like what it does with the tannins. I don't like those. I also just ate some pho, so.
For our cookbook recipes, there is also just one recipe that specifically mentions Pinot Noir as a good candidate, one of the mulled wines, as there are 2 in the first cookbook. This one is specifically just called Medieval Mulled Wine, but our next wine will likely be a candidate for the other mulled wine recipe for Southrons, the House of the Dragon Cabernet Sauvignon. From the website, if there was a wine king, Cabernet Sauvignon would take the crown. As with the Chardonnay earlier, this feels like the perfect place to draw a parallel to Arbor Red, as it is known to be a favorite among the royalty of the Red Keep in King's Landing. Also like the Chardonnay, this Cab Sauv is vinted in California and is described as dense, rich, and jammy with scents of cherry tobacco and vanilla cream and a long mouth-coating finish with just a hint of sweetness. From the winemaker, aged between 9 to 12 months in a mixture of French oak and then is finished with 3 months tanks and barrels which were previously filled with bourbon that aged anywhere between 5 to 8 years. The aged bourbon barrels impart a bolder and more intense character. Again, these descriptions draw further parallels to Arbor Reds. The same wine cellar that tried to sell the Dornish Red to Daenerys also tried to sell her a dry red from the Arbor, crisp and delectable. Certainly a richer color than the Pinot Noir. Here's a little side-by-side, if the green screen will let me pick it up. The aroma's got a lot of plum and rich spices, and I see what they mean about the tobacco note. There's this tobacco shop / antique store that I used to go to, and I probably still have some left, but they have a tobacco called Blackbriar pipe tobacco, and this very much draws some parallels to that for me. That's very good. That's grape juice, man. There's a bold blackberry note on the palate, some dried ginger, just a little bit of spice characteristic to it, and caramel and vanilla that are kind of coming all from that bourbon barrel that it's spent some time in, which some people will have an issue, at least, with the fact that there is a distilled spirit involved here, even if it is just something that the barrel was previously used for. And they may say, well, there wouldn't have been distilled spirits because that was an invention much later in human history, but again, this is fiction. And we do know at least some level of distillation is possible in Westeros through mentions of things like Tyroshi pear brandy. So, not out of the question. Anyways, that mouthfeel is rich, cloying, and certainly syrupy, with a caramel sweetness on the finish and some more oaky, not quite bitterness, but that intense caramelization, and then back into some hints of those plum notes that you get on the aroma.
Yeah, this one already smells darker. I really like that.
Man, no wonder so many people in Westeros are poisoned with Arbor Reds. If they were anything like this Cab Sauv, it'd be hard to say no to a glass. Also, as previously alluded to, this particular wine will make for a great Southron mulled wine, as that recipe calls for either Cabernet Sauvignon or Shiraz, and I think Arbor Reds can certainly be classified as Southron vintages by most of Westeros. To be fair, so could Pinot Noir as a Dornish Red, if that's the parallel we're making, but whatever. Lastly, let's move on to the final and arguably heaviest of the wines produced for House of the Dragon, the Red Blend. An intricate blend is winemaking art, like a tapestry woven together of many threads. Defiant by nature and bold in character, this red blend embodies these qualities that promotes the artistic side of winemaking. This description invokes the current season's title sequence with the tapestry weaving together rather than the previous season and previous show's use of miniatures. I'm assuming the connection is intentional, and I like it. Hailing from Lodi in Northern California, this particular red blend is described as follows. Velvety and dark in color with aromas of cocoa, cranberry, and black currant. Rich maple, dark red fruit, toffee, and creamy caramel coat the palate and add to the balanced and juicy mouthfeel. Finishes with layers of dark berries and coffee. For our final note from the winemaker, they call it a blend of the classics. 52% Cabernet Sauvignon, 20% Petit Verdot, and 8% Malbec. Punctuated by 20% Zinfandel, a notorious renegade from the appellation. Aged in French oak with medium toast for 9 months to smooth off the rough edges. These descriptions draw parallels to the private stock of Runsford red wine, Lord of the Arbor. It was a strong wine with a dark purple color and described as languorous and heady on the tongue. So where the Pinot Noir was a chocolate-covered strawberry vibe, emphasis on the strawberry, in an odd turn of events, I thought that this one would have more chocolatiness on it than something like the Pinot Noir. But because the Pinot Noir is such a light wine, I think any earthy characteristics or chocolatiness on that shine through a lot, whereas this is so heavy that I'm getting so much rich, dark berry and cherry, and it's like concentrated red fruit with maybe a little hint of chocolatiness on the nose. Well, as it opens up, I'm getting a little more chocolate, but oh yeah, that palate is a rich, sweetness, very earthy, lots of black cherry and plum, but like, again, super duper intense. It is by far the heaviest on the mouthfeel. It is round and chewy and almost creamy, and definitely syrupy. But then that finish is very much all earth and toasted oak and caramel and toffee, very rich and intense dark flavors. So I am glad that we tasted them in this order, because if we went with this one first, it probably would have just blown out the whole palate there.
Whoa, it smells like almost smoky. I kind of like that one.
That one is the House of the Dragon Lodi Red Blend.
What does that mean?
It's a region in California.
Oh.
As a blend, this wine will be perfect for the Game of Thrones official cookbook's recipe for 𝖆𝖑𝖒𝖦. While spiced wines have been popular since at least Pliny the Elder's writings in the Roman Empire, it was not referred to as anything tangential to 𝖆𝖑𝖒𝖦 until the 14th century in England and France, likely as a nod to the Greek philosopher and physician Hippocrates. In Martin's writings, it is speculated that the Targaryens were the ones to bring 𝖆𝖑𝖒𝖦 to Westeros in their conquests from Valyria. I'm certainly excited to taste a potential favored brew of Aegon the Conqueror. Before we conclude our journey today, I need to shout out Patrick from the YouTube channel Lone Wolf Interactive, who graciously provided the background for this video that he crafted in the Unreal Engine. He's got a lot of great videos of time lapses making his builds, and you should check him out and subscribe. Linked above is the video that led me to reach out to him when I pondered how best to transport myself into the Great Hall of Winterfell. Thanks, Patrick. And with that, if you'll excuse me, I need to go prepare these wines for their respective recipes in the Winterfell kitchens. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on those. If you feel so inclined to support this growing channel, feel free to toss me a coin right here on YouTube and become one of my first channel members. You can also join the lovely folks over on Patreon, like the noble benefactor IKnewThatWasADog, if that's more your speed. Check out some of my other videos here and here. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in part 2, my friends. To leave you with a quote from everyone's favorite Lannister, I drink and I know things.